In a town called Redemption, a place that had offered her none, a woman with nothing left to lose held a secret that could ignite a war. She was pregnant alone and scorned by every soul who passed her on the dusty street. But in the dead of night, with a tattered shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a carving knife in her hand, she would defy the most powerful man in the territory. This isn't a story about a gunslinger or a lawman. It's the story of how a quiet act of courage, born from the ashes of rejection, changed the fate of the frontier forever. What she did in Whisper Creek Canyon would echo for generations. The dust of redemption. Gulch was a living thing. It coated every surface, settled in the lines of every face, and painted the world in a uniform shade of weary brown. For Clara May Thompson, it was the taste of shame. It clung to the back of her throat as she walked the single street that cut through the raw-boned town, her gaze fixed on the splintered boardwalk beneath her worn-out boots. She felt the stares like physical blows, the whispered judgments that followed her like a shadow. There she is. Thorne's Folly. Her condition was no longer a secret. The gentle swell of her belly, hidden for months beneath carefully layered dresses, now pushed defiantly against the thin calico. It was a testament to a promise whispered under a canopy of summer stars, a promise made by the very man whose name was now used to condemn her Bartholomew Thorne. He was the architect of Redemption Gulch, a man who owned the land, the saloon, the mercantile, and it seemed the morality of its people. His word was law, his wealth a fortress. Clara had been a laundress, her hands perpetually raw from lye, soap, and boiling water. Bartholomew had sought her out. He'd spoken of a life beyond the drudgery of soft fabrics, and a home with glass windows. He had a wife, a frail, sickly woman, who lived in a different world of medicine bottles and hushed rooms, but he'd assured Clara that was a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement. He'd told Clara she was his heart, his future. She, a girl with nothing but calloused hands and a desperate hope, had believed him. She had given him everything. The moment she'd whispered the news of her pregnancy, his face had changed. The warmth had evaporated, replaced by a glacial fury. He called her a liar, a schemer trying to trap him. He accused her of consorting with others, of attempting to pass off some common bastard as his own. The rejection was swift and brutal. He'd had her thrown out of her small rented room above the mercantile, his mercantile, and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the growing life inside her. His public denouncement had been her social execution. Now she lived in a ramshackle cabin, a mile out of town, a derelict shack left behind by a prospector who'd either struck it rich or died trying. The wind whistled through the gaps in the chinking, and the roof leaked in 3 different places. But it was hers. It was a refuge from the accusing eyes of the townswomen and the leering smirks of the men who now saw her as ruined and therefore available. She survived by foraging, selling bundles of herbs and edible mushrooms to the very few who would still trade with her, and by mending clothes for pennies. Her world had shrunk to the confines of that dusty cabin and the surrounding woods. She spoke to no one but the birds and the rustling pines. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space where hope used to be. The baby was her only companion, a secret flutter beneath her ribs that was both her greatest shame and her only reason to draw breath each morning. She would often rest a hand on her stomach and whisper to the child, promising it a world better than this, a promise she had no idea how to keep. One sweltering afternoon, as she returned from gathering wild onions near the creek, she saw him. Bartholomew Thorne, astride his magnificent black stallion, looking more like a king than a rancher. He was with his foreman, a cruel slab of a man named Dexter Cobb. They weren't looking at her. Their attention was fixed on the distant hills, the lands that bordered the territory of the Plains tribes. "It's a slow bleed," Dexter Thorne was saying, his voice carrying on the still air. "They take a steer here, a horse there. We need a reason, a real reason to push them out for good. The government won't act on petty theft. They need an outrage." Dexter Cobb spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "An outrage is easy enough to make, Mr. Thorne." Thorne's eyes cold and grey as a winter sky glinted. "Indeed, we need something undeniable. Something that will make even the bleeding hearts back east demand retribution. Something theatrical." They rode on their words, swallowed by the clop of hooves and the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. Clara hurried toward her cabin, her heart thudding against her ribs. She didn't understand the full scope of his words, but she understood the tone. It was the same tone he had used with her when he cast her aside, the sound of calculated cruelty, of a man arranging lives and deaths as if they were pieces on a chessboard. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Bartholomew Thorne was planning to create his outrage, and that innocent blood would be the ink he used to write his claim to more land, more power. That night she sat by her small fire, her hand resting on her belly, and felt a fear that had nothing to do with her own survival. The world was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and the monster she knew intimately was about to cast a much larger and darker shadow. 2 days later, a palpable tension settled over Redemption Gulch. It was a subtle shift, like a change in the wind before a storm. Men gathered in tight knots outside the saloon, their voices low and urgent. Dexter Cobb and a handful of Thorne's most hardened ranch hands had been seen riding out early, armed with more than just their usual sidearms. They carried heavy-gauge rifles and coils of thick, tarred rope. Clara, needing to trade a bundle of dried sage for a small bag of flour, was forced to venture into town. She kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight, but she couldn't block out the snippets of conversation that snagged in the air. Up near Whisper Creek Canyon. Thorne's offering a bonus. Teach them a lesson they won't forget. Whisper Creek Canyon. The name sent a fresh shiver of dread through her. It was a treacherous, narrow passage through the rocky bluffs, a place travelers usually avoided. It was also a place she knew well. The damp, shaded walls were rich with the kind of mosses and ferns she used to make poultices. Drawn by an instinct, she couldn't name a grim magnetic pull of impending doom. She decided to take the long way back to her cabin, a path that would lead her along the ridge overlooking the canyon. She moved silently through the ponderosa pines, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of needles. The air grew still and heavy as she neared the canyon's edge. Lying flat on her stomach, she peered over the precipice. What she saw below confirmed her worst fears. Cobb and his men were not hunting cattle rustlers. They were setting a trap. They had stretched massive nets, woven from the thick ropes she'd seen them carrying between the canyon walls. The nets were cleverly disguised with branches and leaves positioned in a section where the canyon floor narrowed to a bottleneck. On either side, men were concealed behind boulders, and in the thick underbrush, holding the trigger ropes that would spring the snare. It was a hunter's ambush designed not to kill, but to capture, to ensnare. Clara felt sick. This was Thorne's theatrical outrage. He wasn't going to simply attack a hunting party. That could be dismissed as a skirmish. He was going to capture people, display them, humiliate them. He was manufacturing a crisis. As she lay there, hidden and trembling, she heard the faint, rhythmic sound of approaching horses. It was a slow, unhurried pace, not the gait of a war party. Peering further down the canyon, she saw them. It was a man and 2 small children. The man rode with an easy, dignified grace, his broad shoulders straight, his long black hair braided neatly. He was clearly a warrior, but today he was a father. A small girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, rode on a pony beside him, her expression serious as she listened to whatever he was saying. Tucked securely in a cradleboard on his back was a much younger child, a toddler, whose dark, curious eyes peeked out at the world. They were not raiders. They were a family. They carried no weapons besides a simple hunting bow and a knife at the man's belt. They were likely traveling to a summer encampment or a trading post using the canyon as a shortcut. They were walking into a cage of thorns making. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to shout a warning, but she was too far away, and the men below were too close. Any sound would only reveal her position and do nothing to stop the inevitable. All she could do was watch in horrified silence. The man Torian, as she would later learn his name, seemed to sense something amiss. He reined in his horse just before the bottleneck, his head tilting as he scanned the seemingly empty canyon walls. He held up a hand, and his daughter Lena immediately fell silent, her own pony stopping in its tracks. For a heart-stopping moment, Clara thought he would turn back. His instincts, honed by a life on the plains, were screaming at him. But then the toddler on his back, Nara, let out a small, happy gurgle, a sound of pure innocence that shattered the tension. Torian glanced back at his youngest, a gentle smile briefly softening the hard lines of his face. Perhaps he thought his caution was misplaced, that he was being overly protective. He gave a soft command, and they moved forward again, directly into the kill zone. The moment the front hooves of his horse touched the concealed tripwire, the world exploded into chaos. The nets sprang up from the ground with a vicious whoosh, engulfing them completely. The horses screamed and reared their legs, tangling in the heavy mesh. Torian was thrown to the ground, his first instinct to shield the cradleboard on his back from the impact. The older girl, Lena, was ripped from her pony's back, landing in a heap, tangled in the suffocating ropes. Before the dust even settled, Cobb and his men swarmed out from their hiding places, whooping and hollering like madmen. They descended on the netted family, their faces alight with a cruel victory. From her perch on the cliff, Clara pressed her face into the dirt, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was a helpless witness to the prelude of Bartholomew Thorne's war. The trap had been sprung, and the first victims were a father and his 2 little girls. The scene below unfolded with a brutal efficiency that turned Clara's stomach to ice. Torian, tangled in the heavy ropes, fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He roared, not in fear, but in pure, unadulterated rage, his powerful muscles straining against the thick cords. His only goal was to get to his children. Lena was crying a mixture of terror and pain as she struggled to free her arms. The toddler Nara, still strapped to the cradleboard that had been knocked from her father's back, began to wail a high, piercing sound of infantile terror that cut through the canyon. Dexter Cobb approached, a grin splitting his grizzled face. He held a long wooden club. "That's enough of that, Chief," he sneered, and brought the club down hard on Torian's shoulder. The warrior grunted in pain, his struggles momentarily ceasing. 2 other men seized the opportunity, pulling the ropes tighter, pinning his arms and legs until he was completely immobilized. "Check on the little ones," Cobb ordered, gesturing with his club. "Thorne wants them alive and presentable." One of the men, a younger hand named Floyd, untangled Lena from the net. He handled her roughly, yanking her to her feet. She tried to bite him, and he laughed, shaking her like a rag doll. "Feisty little thing, ain't she?" They dragged their captives to the base of a large rock face, securing them with fresh lengths of rope. Torian was tied in a standing position, his arms stretched taut against the cold stone. His daughters were tied beside him, their small wrists bound. He never took his eyes off them, murmuring to them in their native tongue, his voice a low, soothing rumble despite his own pain and predicament. He was trying to calm them, to be their rock, even as he was literally tied to one. Clara lay on the ridge, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the dust and grime. This was a horror beyond anything she had imagined. The casual cruelty, the gleeful shouts of the captors, the terrified cries of the children, it was a vision from hell. And she knew, with sickening certainty, who was the devil orchestrating it. As if summoned by her thoughts, Bartholomew Thorne himself arrived. He rode into the canyon, not like a rancher, but like a conquering general reviewing his troops. He dismounted his expensive leather boots, crunching on the gravel, a look of immense satisfaction on his face. "Excellent work, Dexter," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. He walked slowly around the captives, inspecting them as if they were livestock. He stopped in front of Torian, whose eyes burned with a hatred so pure and intense it was almost tangible. "You see," Thorne said, speaking directly to the bound warrior, though his words were for his men, "this is what happens when you cross me. You steal my cattle, you trespass on my land. Now you will serve as a message." Torian spat at Thorne's feet. Thorne didn't flinch. He simply wiped a fleck of spittle from his boot with a silk handkerchief. "Spirit. I like that," Thorne said with a chilling smile. "It will make the show all the more convincing." He turned to Cobb. "Bring them to the old holding pen at the edge of the ranch. Keep them under guard, but don't mark them up anymore. I want the townsfolk to see them tomorrow. I want them to see the savages who have been preying on us. I want them to see the children, Dexter. That's the key. People will see them and imagine their own children being snatched from their beds. Fear is a powerful tool. By the end of the week, they'll be begging me to lead a militia to wipe this filth from the earth." The pieces of his monstrous plan clicked into place in Clara's mind. It wasn't just about land. It was about power. He would manufacture a threat, present himself as the savior, and consolidate his control over the entire territory, all with the town's blessing. He would be a hero, celebrated for a crisis he himself had created. The warrior and his daughters were merely props in his gruesome play. Thorne mounted his horse. "I'll ride ahead, spread the word. Make it look good, Dexter." With a final triumphant look at his captives, he rode away, leaving his men to drag the prisoners from the canyon. Clara remained frozen on the ridge long after they were gone. The only sounds the whisper of the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. The image of that father, bound and helpless, trying to comfort his terrified daughters, was burned into her memory. She saw in his eyes the same protective desperation she felt for her own unborn child. Thorne had taken her dignity, her reputation, and her future. Now he was doing the same to this family, on a scale she could barely comprehend, all for the sake of his own greed. A new feeling began to smoulder in the cold ashes of her despair. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in months, rage, a quiet, deep and unyielding fury. Bartholomew Thorne thought he had crushed her, that she was nothing more than a piece of embarrassing history. He thought her powerless, insignificant, lying there on the dusty cliffside with the weight of her unborn child pressing against the earth. Clara May Thompson made a decision. Thorne was wrong. She was not powerless, and she would not stand by and watch him build his empire on the ruins of this innocent family. She didn't have a gun or men or money, but she had knowledge of the terrain, a laundress's sharpest knife meant for cutting threads, and a spirit that had been bent but not broken. Tonight, she would do something. Tonight, the outcast of Redemption Gulch would become a ghost in the darkness. As twilight bled across the sky, staining the clouds in hues of violet and bruised orange, Clara made her way back to her cabin. Her movements were no longer hesitant or weary. They were driven by a purpose that sharpened her senses and deadened the ache in her back. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by the burning resolve that had taken root in the canyon. She didn't light a lamp. The darkness was her ally, a cloak she would need to wrap herself in. Moving by the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window, she began to prepare. Her resources were meager, but her mind was clear. From a small wooden chest, she took her sharpest knife, a tool with a thin, wickedly pointed blade used for fine sewing repairs and cutting tough leather. She ran her thumb over the whetstone, honing an edge that could part a thread with a whisper. Next, she gathered food, a handful of dried jerky and a small, hard biscuit. It wasn't much, but it might be all the family had. She filled her waterskin from the barrel outside the water, cool and precious. Finally, she rummaged through her collection of herbs. She found what she was looking for: a bundle of dried yarrow to staunch bleeding, and a small pouch of willow bark, the frontier's answer to pain. She wrapped these items along with the knife and food in a dark piece of cloth, creating a small, tight bundle. Her own needs were secondary. She took a moment to drink deeply from the waterskin, feeling the cool liquid soothe her dry throat. She pressed a hand to her belly, a silent communication with the life inside her. We have to do this, she thought, not as a choice, but as a statement of fact, because to do nothing is to be just like them. The holding pen Thorn had mentioned was an old, abandoned corral on the far western edge of his sprawling property. It was miles from the main ranch house, chosen for its isolation. Clara knew the area. She had picked berries in the woods that bordered it just a few weeks ago. The location meant to keep the prisoners hidden until Thorn's grand reveal would also work to her advantage. Security would be present, but likely lax. Thorn's men were arrogant, confident that no one would dare challenge them. She wrapped her darkest shawl around her shoulders, the rough wool scratching her skin. It would help her blend into the shadows. Slipping out of her cabin, she was just another part of the night. The moon was a sliver, offering just enough light to see the path, but not enough to expose her. The journey was an ordeal. The mile-long walk, which was trivial just a few months ago, was now a monumental effort. Her swollen ankles protested, and a persistent pain throbbed in her lower back. She had to stop several times, leaning against the rough bark of a pine tree, catching her breath, her lungs burning. Each time she wanted to give up, to turn back to the relative safety of her hovel, the image of Lena's terrified face and Nara's wailing cries flashed in her mind. She thought of Torian's eyes filled with a defiant fire that not even Thorn's cruelty could extinguish. She pushed on. As she drew closer, the scent of a campfire reached her acrid and sharp on the night air. She dropped into a low crouch, her movements becoming painstakingly slow. The trees thinned, and she could see the holding pen ahead. It was a crude enclosure of thick wooden posts and rails, originally built for breaking wild horses. A small fire crackled near the gate, casting flickering shadows. 2 men were on guard. One was Floyd, the young ranch hand who had taunted Lena. The other was a burly, bearded man she didn't recognize. They were passing a bottle of whiskey, back and forth, their laughter loud and coarse in the stillness of the night. "Thorn's gonna be a legend after this," Floyd slurred, taking a long pull from the bottle. "Might even run for territorial governor." "He pays well enough," the other man grunted. "Don't care what he runs for long as the coin's good. Still gives me the creeps keeping the kids." "Ah, they're just bait," Floyd dismissed. "Keeps the big buck from being too much trouble. Smart you ask me." Clara crept closer, using a line of dense juniper bushes as cover. From her new vantage point, She could see inside the pen. Torian was tied to the central snubbing post, the ropes cutting deep into his wrists and chest. His head was bowed in what looked like exhaustion, but she could see the subtle, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. His daughters were huddled together at the base of the post, tied by their ankles. They seemed to be asleep, their small bodies curled together for warmth and comfort. She watched the guards for what felt like an eternity. Their conversation dwindled as the whiskey took hold. The bearded man eventually rolled himself in his blanket and was soon snoring loudly. Floyd remained awake, but his vigilance was dulled. He stared into the fire, his posture slumped, taking infrequent sips from the bottle. This was her chance. It would be the only one she would get. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was afraid Floyd would hear it. She clutched the bundle in her hand, the handle of the knife cold and solid against her palm. She took a slow, deep breath, trying to calm the tremor in her hands. The night was silent, except for the crackle of the fire, the snoring of the guard, and the whisper of the wind, a wind that seemed to be urging her forward into the darkness, toward the most dangerous and necessary act of her life. Clara waited until Floyd's head nodded forward, his chin resting on his chest. He was dozing, caught in the drunken space between wakefulness and sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep red light that made the shadows at the edge of the corral seem vast and bottomless. Now. It had to be now. Moving with a silence she didn't know she possessed, she slipped from the cover of the juniper bushes. She didn't head for the gate, which creaked, and was too close to the sleeping guards. Instead, she circled around to the back of the pen where the shadows were deepest. The wooden rails were thick and rough. Finding a space between two posts, she squeezed through the coarse wood, snagging on her shawl. For a terrifying second, she was stuck, the pressure on her pregnant belly making her gasp. With a final desperate push, she was through, stumbling silently onto the soft dirt inside the enclosure. She was in. She paused, every muscle tensed, listening. The snoring guard hadn't stirred. Floyd mumbled something in his sleep but didn't move. She was a ghost in their midst. She crept toward the central post, her bare feet making no sound. As she drew near, Torian's head lifted slowly. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, found her immediately. She saw a flicker of confusion, then deep, profound suspicion. He thought she was one of them, perhaps sent to torment him further. He straightened slightly, the ropes creaking under the strain, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Clara froze. She raised a single finger to her lips, her eyes wide, pleading for his silence. She then held up the knife, letting the faint red glow of the embers catch the steel blade for a brief moment. Not as a threat, but as a promise. Understanding dawned in his eyes. The suspicion didn't vanish entirely, but it was replaced by a cautious, watchful stillness. He was a man willing to accept a miracle but prepared for a trick. She knelt first beside the children. Her hands trembled as she touched the rough rope binding Lena's ankles. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. A small gasp escaped her lips, and Clara immediately put a gentle hand over her mouth, shaking her head slowly. The girl's eyes were huge and dark in the dim light, filled with the same terror Clara had seen in the canyon. But looking at Clara, a woman, her face soft with pity, her belly round with child, the terror subsided into a wide-eyed wonder. Clara sawed at the ropes with her small, sharp knife. The hemp was thick and stiff. It was slow, agonizing work. Each soft scrape of the blade against the fibers sounded like a gunshot in the silent night. Her back screamed in protest, but she ignored it, focusing only on the task. Finally, with a soft snap, the first rope parted, then the second. She moved to the sleeping toddler Nara and cut her free with equal care. Then she moved to Torian. His bonds were far thicker, pulled brutally tight. She had to stand on her tiptoes to reach the ropes, binding his wrists to the post above his head. She worked frantically, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The angle was awkward, her muscles straining. A strand parted. Then another. Suddenly outside the pen, Floyd snorted and shifted in his sleep. Clara flattened herself against the post, pressing her body into the shadows, her heart lodged in her throat. She held her breath, waiting. Floyd settled again, his head lolling to the other side. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and went back to work. She started on the thick ropes around Torian's chest. He remained impossibly still, a statue of patience, though she could feel the tension radiating from him. He was a coiled spring ready to explode into action the second he was free. Finally, the last cord around his chest gave way. He was free from the post, though his wrists were still bound in front of him. He didn't wait for her to cut the final bond. With a surge of incredible strength, he snapped the frayed rope by sheer force. He was free. He didn't make a sound. He bent down his movements, fluid and silent, and gently scooped up the sleeping Nara, settling her cradleboard securely on his back. He motioned to Lena, who scrambled to her feet and clung to his leg. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, she saw something other than suspicion or pain in his eyes. It was a look of profound, silent gratitude. A debt acknowledged. He reached out and took the small bundle of food and herbs from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, his skin calloused and warm. It was the first human touch she had felt in months that wasn't accidental or hostile. He pointed towards the back of the pen the way she had come in. He was a warrior, and he was now in command of this escape. He would see his family to safety. Just as they were about to move, Lena tugged on her father's hand and pointed a small finger at Clara's stomach. She whispered something to her father in their language. Torian looked at Clara, his gaze dropping to her belly, and his expression softened with a new understanding. He now saw not just a rescuer, but a fellow protector, a mother-to-be risking everything. He gave a short, sharp nod. It conveyed more than words ever could. It meant, "I see you. I understand. I will not forget this." He lifted Lena effortlessly through the rails, then slipped through himself with the grace of a panther. Clara followed her escape, less graceful this time, her body clumsy and heavy. Once clear, Torian didn't flee immediately. He paused, looking back at the two sleeping guards by the dying fire. A dangerous light entered his eyes. He could have easily taken his revenge, silenced them forever with the knife Clara had given him. Clara saw the look and shook her head, a small, desperate motion. She hadn't done this for vengeance. She had done it for life. He held her gaze for a long moment, an internal battle playing out across his stoic features. Then he gave another curt nod, this one of assent. He turned, and with his daughters melted into the impenetrable darkness of the woods, leaving no more trace of his presence than a whisper on the wind. Clara stood alone in the cool night air, the empty holding pen behind her, and watched them go. She had cut the cords of their captivity, but in doing so, she had tied her own fate inextricably to theirs. Dawn broke with a fury that matched Bartholomew Thorne's. When word reached him of the empty corral, he rode to the scene himself, his face a mask of thunderous rage. He saw the cut ropes, the telltale signs of a rescue, and his plan so meticulously constructed crumbled into dust. "Fools, incompetent, drunken fools!" he roared, striking Floyd across the face with his leather gloves. Floyd stumbled back, blood trickling from his lip, his eyes wide with fear. "You had two jobs. Keep them here, and keep them alive. You failed at the first, and I ought to ensure you fail at the second." Dexter Cobb, ever the pragmatist, was already examining the scene. He was not a man given to outbursts. His cruelty was a cold, methodical thing. He circled the holding pen, his eyes missing nothing. "Wasn't a war party," Cobb said, his voice a low gravel. No tracks of shod horses, no signs of a struggle. Whoever did this was quiet, knew what they were doing. He knelt, picking something from a splinter on one of the fence rails. He held it up. It was a tiny scrap of fabric, dark wool with a single faded blue thread running through it. Thorne snatched it from his foreman's fingers. He stared at it, his mind racing. Who in this town had the nerve? Who had the motive? A sympathizer? A rival? Then his eyes narrowed, a dreadful certainty dawning. He had seen that cheap rough wool before. He had seen that specific faded blue thread. It was from the shawl of the woman he had cast aside, the laundress, Clara May Thompson. "Her!" He whispered, the single word laced with venom. It was her. Cobb looked incredulous. The pregnant girl, the outcast. How could she? "Do not question me." Thorne bellowed, his fury returning twofold. The humiliation was unbearable. To be undone not by a rival rancher or a band of warriors, but by the meek, ruined woman he had discarded. She had made a fool of him. She had defied him. In his mind, her act of compassion was a direct, personal attack, an unforgivable act of treason. "She lives in that shack out by the old Miller place," Thorne snarled. "Get the men, all of them. I want her, and I want her now." He mounted his stallion, his face contorted with a vengeful madness. "And bring a rope. She's going to tell us where they went, and then she's going to pay for this." The pursuit was swift and merciless. Thorne and a dozen of his riders thundered out of the ranch, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust that was visible for miles. They rode with the grim purpose of a lynch mob, their faces set and hard. The news of the escape was already spreading through Redemption Gulch, but Thorne was twisting the narrative. It wasn't a rescue. It was a conspiracy. The savages had allies in town, he claimed, traitors who would see them all murdered in their beds. He was turning his personal vendetta into a public crusade. Clara had not returned to her cabin immediately. Exhausted and emotionally drained, she had found a small hidden alcove in the rocks, a half-mile from her home, to rest. As the sun climbed higher, she saw the plume of dust rising from the direction of Thorne's ranch. She knew what it meant. They had discovered the escape, and sooner or later they would come for her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her first instinct was to run, to flee into the wilderness, where they might never find her. But where would she go? She was heavy with child, exhausted, and had no supplies. She wouldn't survive a day. Her cabin, as poor as it was her only sanctuary. Perhaps they wouldn't suspect her. Perhaps Thorne's arrogance would blind him to the possibility that she, of all people, could be responsible. It was a sliver of hope, but it was all she had. She stumbled back to her home, her mind a whirlwind of fear. She barred the flimsy door and pushed her small, rickety table against it. It was a pathetic defense against a dozen angry men, but it was something. She sat on her cot, her hands wrapped around her stomach, and waited. The sound of hoofbeats grew from a distant rumble to a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of her small cabin. They surrounded the house, the shouts of men and the snorting of horses, creating a terrifying cacophony. "Clara May Thompson," Thorne's voice boomed, dripping with malice. "You have nowhere to run. Come out now and face your judgment." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling. This was it. This was the end. She had freed one family only to condemn herself and her unborn child. "Break down the door," she heard Thorne command. The wood splintered under the impact of a heavy boot, then another. The door groaned, the bar cracking. It was only a matter of seconds. Clara pushed herself into the corner of the room, trying to make herself as small as possible, a final futile instinct for self-preservation. The door burst inward, ripped from its leather hinges, and the cabin was flooded with harsh sunlight and the menacing silhouettes of armed men. Bartholomew Thorne stepped inside his large frame, filling the doorway. His face was a mask of pure hatred, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "You," he seethed, stepping toward her. "You thought you could defy me. You thought you could make a fool of me. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" He stood over her, a giant, casting a deathly shadow. Clara couldn't speak. She could only stare back at the man who had first promised her, the world then taken it away, and had now come to take the very last thing she had left her life. "Where did you send them?" Thorne's voice was a low, guttural thing, the sound of grinding stones. He advanced into the cramped space of the cabin, his sheer size seeming to shrink the room to suck the very air from it. He grabbed a fistful of Clara's worn calico dress, hauling her from the corner and onto her feet with a brutal lack of care. A blinding, sharp pain shot through her abdomen, and she cried out, her hands instinctively going to her belly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she gasped, the lie thin and desperate on her tongue. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. "Don't you dare play the fool with me, Clara!" He sneered, his face now inches from hers, the stale scent of whiskey and a deeper, more acrid smell of pure rage washed over her. "I taught you better than to lie to me. I found a piece of your shawl at the pen, your pathetic threadbare shawl with that ridiculous blue thread, the same one you wore the night you came begging to me." He let the memory hang in the air, another tool of humiliation. "Now for the last time, which way did the savage go?" He gave her a violent shake, and the world tilted. Her meager possessions stacked neatly on a crate tumbled to the floor. A clay pot shattered the sound, unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Behind him, Dexter Cobb stepped forward, a length of thick rope coiled in his hand, a chillingly pragmatic smile touching his lips. The other men, a dozen of them, crowded in the doorway and around the cabin, their expressions a mixture of grim anticipation and a burgeoning queasy discomfort. They were ranch hands, men accustomed to hard work and the occasional brawl, but this was different. The sight of their powerful boss, a man who owned their wages and their futures, brutalizing a lone, pregnant woman, was beginning to curdle their stomachs. Clara's gaze flickered past Thorne, past his mask of fury to the faces of the men behind him. She saw the uncertainty in their eyes, the flicker of doubt in the way they held their rifles, their knuckles white. They were not all monsters like Cobb. They were followers' men who had been led here by lies. It was her only chance, her only weapon. She had to break the spell. "He's lying to you," she said, her voice trembling but finding a core of unexpected strength. She wasn't just speaking to Thorne, she was speaking to them. "To all of you." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Listen to the little traitor spinning her tales. There was no raid. Clara continued, her eyes locking with a young ranch hand near the door, who quickly looked away. He wanted a reason to start a war, a reason to clear the tribes off their land, the land he wants. I was there. I saw it. He set a trap in Whisper Creek Canyon and stole that family a father and his 2 little girls. A murmur went through the crowd of men. A few of them exchanged uneasy glances. The official story had been of a captured war party, responsible for weeks of theft and violence. This new version, told by this desperate woman, had the unnerving ring of truth. "Look at me," she pleaded, her voice rising. "Do I look like the ally of murderers? Or do I look like someone who couldn't stand by and watch a man use his own men to slaughter innocents for a patch of dirt?" She took a ragged breath, her gaze sweeping over them. "He doesn't care about you. He will send you to fight and die for his greed, and he will call you heroes while he counts his money. He is using you just as he used me." "Silence!" Thorn roared, his composure finally snapping. The truth in her words was more dangerous to him than any weapon. He raised his hand, the leather of his glove creaking, poised to strike her to silence her permanently. But the blow never landed. An abrupt, unnatural stillness fell over the clearing. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. The nervous stamping of the horses ceased. The birdsong in the pines cut off mid-trill. The wind, which had been whispering through the trees, died completely. One of Thorn's men, posted at the edge of the clearing, slowly lowered his rifle, his mouth agape as he stared into the tree line. From the dense, dark line of the forest, figures began to emerge. They did not rush or charge. They materialized, stepping from the deep shadows into the stark sunlight, with a spectral silence that was far more terrifying than any war cry. It was Torian. He was not alone. Behind him stood a half-dozen warriors, their faces grim and impassive, their bodies adorned with the stark, meaningful patterns of men prepared for the ultimate conflict. They were armed not just with bows and lances, but with an aura of absolute resolve. They fanned out, creating a silent, unbreachable semicircle, their movements economical and precise. They did not shout. They did not taunt. They simply stood and watched, their collective gaze cold and sharp as obsidian flakes fixed on one man, Bartholomew Thorn. Thorn froze, his hand still raised in the air. The vibrant color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. The men behind him, who had been a confident mob just moments before, were now a terrified, shrinking huddle. Their bravado, fueled by numbers and whiskey, evaporated in the face of the silent, deadly warriors who had appeared, as if summoned from the very earth. They had come for a helpless woman. They had found themselves facing the quiet wrath of legends. Torian took a single deliberate step forward. He was not looking at Thorn's men. His focus was entirely on the man who had wronged him. In his hand, he held the small, simple knife Clara had given him. He held it up not as a threat, but as a symbol, letting the sunlight glint off the blade for all to see. Then his eyes met Thorn's, and they were not filled with the hot rage of a captive anymore. They held a cold, absolute contempt that was far more devastating. He didn't need to speak a word. His presence was his testimony. His warriors were his truth. This woman is protected. This land has guardians. Your lies end here. The standoff was absolute, a tableau of two opposing forces. On one side, Thorn, his power built on bluster fear and coin now exposed as a fraud. On the other, Torian, a man who had lost everything but his honor, now standing as an unbreakable pillar of justice. Thorn's authority, the very foundation of his identity, crumbled in that silence. His men were no longer looking at him for orders. They were looking at the warriors then, at Clara, and the full weight of the deception settled upon them. They had been lied to. They had been made the villains in a story where they were told they were the heroes. Dexter Cobb, for the first time in his life, looked uncertain. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, lowered the rope he held. Thorn, feeling the support of his men dissolve behind him, finally understood. He was alone. He slowly lowered his hand, his arm feeling unnaturally heavy. The humiliation was a physical thing, a fire in his gut. "This isn't over," he spat. But the words were hollow, a ghost of his former power. He began to back away, stumbling like a drunkard. "Let's go," He ordered his men, his voice tight and strained. No one moved immediately. They were transfixed, caught between the disgrace of their leader and the imposing stillness of the warriors. Then one man at the back slowly turned his horse and began to ride away. Then another. It wasn't a retreat. It was a desertion. Thorn watched his power base disintegrate before his very eyes. With a final venomous glare at Clara, a look that promised a hatred that would fester for years, he turned, scrambled onto his stallion, and galloped away, leading a shamed and broken posse. Clara sagged against the rough wall of her cabin, her legs finally giving out as she slid to the floor. The warriors remained for a long, silent moment, a vigilant guard, ensuring the threat was truly and completely gone. When the last sound of hoofbeats had faded, Torian walked to the cabin door. He knelt and placed the small knife she had given him on the threshold. Beside it, he laid a beautifully beaded pouch filled with medicinal herbs and a strip of smoked venison. His daughter Lena, who had been watching from the safety of the trees, darted forward. In her small hand was a crudely but lovingly carved wooden bird. She placed it gently beside the other items, her large, dark eyes meeting Clara's with a look of profound, childish gratitude. Torian met Clara's gaze one last time. He placed a hand over his heart and gave a slow, respectful nod. It was a gesture that transcended language, a promise of peace, a recognition of a debt paid, an alliance forged in the darkest of nights. Then he and his men turned, and with the same unnerving silence with which they had arrived, they melted back into the forest, leaving Clara alone in the sudden, profound quiet. She was still an outcast. She was still poor. But as she looked at the gifts on her doorstep, a blade returned a token of healing, a child's offering of beauty, she knew she was no longer alone. In a town that had offered her nothing but scorn, she had earned the respect of warriors. And in saving them, she had, against all odds, saved herself. Clara May Thompson's story reminds us that true strength isn't found in the thunder of a six-gun or the power of a wealthy name, but in the quiet, unwavering resolve of the human spirit. It's a testament to the idea that even when society casts you out, your choices can still echo with profound honor and create a redemption all your own. Her courage didn't just cut the ropes that bound an innocent family. It severed the cords of fear and deceit that held an entire town captive. If this tale of quiet defiance and unexpected justice resonated with you, please show your support for the stories of the unsung heroes of the West. Hit that like button to let us know you were moved. Share this video with someone who appreciates true strength, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas from the dusty trails of history. Your support helps us keep these forgotten legacies alive. Until next time, stay courageous.